In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the history of mining and railroads in the American West. In the American West, mining comes first with the discovery of gold in California in 1848. This map shows the discovery of gold and silver in California. Number 1 indicates the 1848 discovery in the area of Sutter's Mill, but as you can see, there were several other areas where gold and probably silver were discovered as well, and this led to a rush of people heading out to California in 1849. They were known as the 49ers, and San Francisco's football team is named after them. Most people came from the East, but folks did come from around the world to try and make it rich. Most, in fact, did not get rich. What you can see from these photos here is the system of mining that was used, which was called placer mining. And gold was panned from streams or rivers, and the silt was washed away, leaving the nuggets of gold that you see here in the pan. Now, most of the people that came out actually did not become wealthy, striking it rich, finding gold or silver. But as word spread, other people came out, and towns quickly developed in the mining areas. And it was the people that came after the original miners that came to serve the needs of the miners that opened businesses to cater to the needs of miners. Levi Strauss is a good example of this. He was a San Francisco tailor who came with denim to the mining camps in the Sutter's Mill area. The miners were thrilled to have him use this material to make pants for them because the denim held up much better than the more finely knitted dress pants would hold up in the dirt and muddy conditions in mining. As a result, the Levi's Jeans Company was born. Other people came to provide the miners with tools and food, and as well as entertainment activities like bars and saloons and things like that. This is a side view of the Comstock mine in Nevada, which was the largest silver mine of its time. You're looking at a cutaway view of the earth in this example, in this poster. The top here would be ground level, so everything you're looking at below the homes pictured on the top is below ground, so ignore the pictures here at the bottom. And the area that I'm going over the mouse with now is actually the vein of silver, and you can see that once placer miners were no longer able to dig down, you're going to have professional mining company with larger machinery come in and begin to dig into the earth, and they're going to set up braces that allow for men to work. You can see in this area men picking away at the silver here. Another example here, you have an elevator shaft to get into a secondary vein that's running through here, and probably a tertiary vein running through here. So this was the way that mines developed underground to begin to get at the silver that the people on the ground were no longer able to get to, because the professional machinery was needed to get to it. And eventually a mining town would turn into a full community with families and religious institutions and schools. That was the final stage in the development of a mining town. What it would lead to, once the mine ran out though, people would quickly leave, and the mountains in Nevada and the far west are dotted with these ghost towns where the mines simply were exhausted, and as a result there was no reason to stay in the town anymore, and people left. I do want to add one last thing before we move on. The reason that these mines were discovered is that as people came out to California, specifically to Sutter's Mill, and were unable to secure a place to begin mining, they began to migrate their way back east, and in doing so actually discovered these other areas of gold and silver that led to the mining towns that you saw on the map. let's move along and talk about railroads. In 1850, or I should say by 1850, you can see that railroads existed primarily in the east. If I increase the size of this map, you can see here in the Northeast you have the majority of railroads. You also have railroads out to the Chicago area and a few railroads down south, but nothing beyond the Mississippi River. There were no railroads, and the government decided, actually during the Civil War, this would be put in place after the Civil War, that there was a need, particularly with people living in the state of California, to connect them with the larger population back east, so that there was a need for a transcontinental railroad to be constructed. The problem that the federal government had was that the railroads had no interest in constructing this transcontinental railroad, that is. It would cost the railroads an absolute fortune of money to lay the 1,000 or 2,000 miles of railroad track that was needed to connect California with the existing railway system just east of the Mississippi River. And the railroads, being private businesses in business to make a profit, had absolutely no guarantee that they would get any kind of return on their investment, meaning that they had no guarantee that there would be enough freight and passengers to ship back and forth to justify the expense of building that railroad. Therefore, the government did in 1862 what you see here. President Lincoln passed the Pacific Railway Act to give the railroads the incentive that they needed to construct the tracks. And what the federal government had a lot of was land. So they gave the railroads a significant amount of land, which the railroads knew they would be able to sell to the public after the railroads were constructed, and therefore they would be able to recover the construction costs of building the railroads through the sale of the land that the government was giving them. This map shows the construction of the very first transcontinental railroad, which was built by two railroad companies, the Union Pacific Railroad, which constructed the stretch in blue, and they started in Omaha, Nebraska in the east and built west. The Central Pacific Railroad started in California, and their stretch of railroad is pictured here in red. They started in Sacramento and built east. Both companies met on May 10th in 1869 in Promontory Point, Utah, and the first transcontinental railroad was complete. If we take a look here, we have some pictures that show the construction of the railroad by both companies, and I'd like to point out that the Union Pacific employed about 8,000 Irish, German, and Italian immigrants, building west from Omaha, Nebraska, as I indicated. The Central Pacific workforce included over 10,000 Chinese laborers. Then they built eastward from Sacramento, California. And yes, advertisements were placed in China to recruit Chinese workers to come and build the railroad. The drawing that you're looking at here shows marksmen on the lookout for Indian attacks, and Indian attacks were a hazard of building the railroad. The Native Americans were not happy with the railroad construction, in part because they knew it would lead to eventual settlement by Americans of their area, and we already discussed in a previous lesson the removal of the Native Americans by the U.S. Army onto reservations, which would open up the land to American settlement. This photo here shows Chinese workers working on the Central Pacific Railroad. This last photo here shows the two railroads meeting at Promontory Point, Utah, the driving in of the Golden Spike in May of 1869. And as I pointed out with the construction of the railroads initially and the land grants that were given, the railroads then proceeded to advertise back east, encouraging people to purchase land near the railroads that were just constructed for farming and whatnot. And this map shows other railroads. Other transcontinental railroads were built as well. The original transcontinental railroad, I'm running the mouse across here, but you can see there was another one built in the northern west, and yet a third built in the southern area, actually a third and a fourth transcontinental railroad built in the southwest. All right, all using the land grants from the government to defray the costs of construction. What this map also shows is one particular improvement that the railroads had to make, and this may sound a little strange for us, but it was the railroad companies that created time zones. All right, prior to this, every community kept its own time, so time was not standardized. You might go a few miles in one direction, and the time would be different than it was in just a few miles back where you were originally. So the railroads, needing a consistent timing for the arrival and departure times of trains, created the time zone system that we use today. And you can see the 4 time zones: the Eastern Time Zone in green, Central Time Zone in purple on this map, Mountain Time in yellow, and Pacific Time in orange. All right, some additional improvements that the railroads made include the use of steel, which replaced iron. Steel is stronger and it will rust, but iron will rust much more quickly. Steel is slower to rust. Track gauges, the width of the track and signals were standardized. Some new inventions, as you can see here. George Westinghouse invented the air brake, and I believe his first name was Grant. Grant Woods invented the telegraph. We'll be talking more about the telegraph in a later lesson. All right, another example of the time zones map. So if we can summarize then. Going back to mining, discovery of gold in California led to the 1949 gold rush. I'm actually going to make this a little bit smaller so it fits inside here. Get that out of the way. That would also lead to 1850, California coming in as a free state. We discussed that in the previous unit. All right, mining towns developed quickly in the area of the find where the gold or the silver had been discovered. All right, the transcontinental railroads were built with government subsidies of land, which again were used to offset the construction costs. So the railroads initially had to issue bonds to cover the construction costs because the employees had to be paid, the materials had to be purchased, all right, and then the bonds would be paid by the railroad companies using the land that the government had given them. Though I should say the proceeds from selling the land to individuals that the government had given them to pay the interest and principal on the bond payments. By the way, that also had the effect with selling the land along near the railroad lines of guaranteeing that there would be both passenger and freight traffic for the railroads. As a result of the Transcontinental Railroad, shipping costs dropped dramatically because the only other way to get things to California was covered wagon, which is not a realistic way to ship large goods across the country, or by boat, which was much more realistic, but you had to go all the way around South America. That trip would take well over 2 weeks, whereas the trip across the country by rail now could be done in fewer than 10 days. This concludes our lesson on mining and railroads.